So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Monica Driggers, and I am the Deputy Director for the Massachusetts Rivers Alliance. Welcome to the Dam Busters 101 series. This is a collaboration between Mass Rivers, the Charles River Watershed Association, and the Massachusetts Division of Ecological Restoration. This is an educational series offering basic information about dam removal to managers from municipalities and nonprofits that may be considering such projects in the future. Please note that the series is not intended to advocate for the removal of any specific dam or dams. Before we move on to today's presentation, I have some announcements about the future of the series, and I hope that these announcements will help you manage your calendars. First, please note that the next webinar will be about permitting, and it will be held on Wednesday, September 11th, which is the second Wednesday of the month from noon to 1. I mean, normally we hold them on the first Wednesday, but given that September is a different month with vacations, etc., we're holding it on September 11th. And that will be the last webinar for this year. But secondly, and this is exciting news from us, we will be holding an in-person dam removal site visit in Braintree on September 18th. It'll also be done as a lunchtime program. We will send out details and information on how to sign up in the next week or so. Right now, we estimate that we can have about 30 people on the tour, so we'll take folks on a first come, first serve basis, but there will also be a wait list in case we can accommodate more people. And we're trying to hold a second site visit tour in October, but we haven't quite finalized those arrangements, so please stay tuned. We will send that information out when it's available. Lastly, for those of you who have been wondering about Dam Busters for next year, we're working on developing that series. Right now, we project that it will start in January or February, and it will likely add topics to what we covered this year, plus offer some more in-depth programming. I know a lot of people have asked about having direct Q&A with the presenters, which is something we're hoping to accommodate. So we're trying to add content that came up in your survey responses, and that again is why those surveys are so important. As always, you can find the most up-to-date information about the series on the Mass Rivers Alliance website at www.massriversalliance.org. So back to today's session, which is on managing sediment. Just a few housekeeping items. Please note that the webinars are being recorded. Recordings and any other webinar materials will be made available on the Mass Rivers website. If you have questions, you can put them in the Q&A feature, which you'll see at the bottom of your screen. We're monitoring that feature, or you can hold your questions until the last half hour's Q&A session. Please put your name and affiliation in the chat. And lastly, again, we just ask that you complete the evaluation survey that will be sent to you after the webinar. And I think we'll also put the link in the chat at some point. That evaluation is very important to us. It's really helping us improve and expand the series. And now I'm truly delighted to introduce today's speaker, Alex Hackman. For the past 16 years, Alex, CERP, has managed projects and programs to restore rivers and wetlands in Massachusetts. He led and assisted on dozens of dam removal projects, authored a draft state guidance document on sediment management for dam removals, and launched and led the state's cranberry bog program. Today, he is the Director of Ecological Restoration for Mass Audubon, oversees the organization's growing practice focusing on salt marshes, urban wetlands, cranberry bogs, and dam removals. Welcome, Alex.
Thank you. I am delighted to be here. Let me get my screen sharing going here and let's have some fun. Okie dokie. How's that looking? All right. Thank you, folks, for being here. Thank you to our hosts. Delighted to be here again. Alex Hackman. This is a thrilling topic, right? Removing dams, freeing rivers, watching that first fish swim beneath your legs when you remove a dam can turn into a passion for life. It's a thrilling thing to do, and I'm so glad that for this interest in this topic and for all that you all are doing to make this happen in the Commonwealth. So you've heard from a lot of other speakers, you've received a lot of wisdom from other practitioners on doing this, removing dams. Today, Let's see if my screen will advance. Here we go. Today, we're going to focus on one of the less glamorous parts of the job, managing material like this that's trapped behind the dam. It's been said to me many times by others, and I agree, that dam removal projects are essentially sediment management projects. Dams can often be removed in as little as one day, but the process of assessing the risks and developing sediment management approaches can take years in some cases. So this is what you can often find behind a dam when you do water it. The material looks like this. Before I get going further, I want to, boy, I'm having a little trouble with my advancing my material. Here we go. I want to note that all these pictures I took while I was with the state DER for 15 years. So I want to say thank you to DER for that opportunity, but also for using these photos. I also want to note that these are my positions as a practitioner, do not necessarily reflect that of my organization. And I do want to give a shout out to my mentor in dam removal, Mike Chelminsky, who taught me much of what I know about dam removals and managing sediment. And in fact, if Mike was with me looking at sediment like that, you know what he'd call it is baby poop. And baby poop is challenging to manage. And let's talk about that. So there is indeed a baby poop behind dams, and it is hard to manage, but there's also this. I want to emphasize that this is also impounded sediment, fuel for the food web, habitat building substrates is also impounded sediment. And how we manage that during a dam removal project affects the success of what we're really trying to do here, which is ecological restoration. It's the process of assisting the recovery of a damaged or degraded or destroyed ecosystem. And if you haven't read the International Principles and Standards of SCR, I strongly encourage you to do that. Our rivers, make no mistake, our rivers are degraded. Damage is an acute short-term impact. Degraded is a severe long-term impact. And that's what the situation is with our rivers. Thousands of dams, hundreds of years, severely degraded. So we need to tailor our responses to the nature of the impact. And to me, assisting in recovery, following up on that definition, really means three things that I want to convey. The first is taking a process-based approach, trying to take actions that repair the engine of nature, let nature take care of itself. The second is focusing on connectivity, taking actions that allow energy and materials and organisms to move freely around the landscape. That's really key to how the engine of nature functions. And lastly, engaging people for their wisdom and long-term care. And in this day and age, I particularly want to call out partnering with local tribes to draw upon ancient wisdom as we seek better ways of caring for our land moving forward. So I say thank you. For those of you who are doing this work, thank you. You get to remove dams. You get to have a grin on your face like me here. This is the top of an impoundment after a dam removal. And look, that river is healing itself. There's spawning gravel already. That's just a short time after a dam removal. So thank you for what you're doing in this space. But today we're going to talk about sediment and dam removals. So I have 4 takeaways for you. First is remove dams to restore rivers. You already all know this. We'll talk about that. Number 2, keep sediment in rivers whenever possible to do even more restoration. Number 3, only use costly dredging and disposal when you identify significant risks. And then 4th, evaluate local conditions to decide. So let's talk about the first one, remove dams to restore rivers. Let's talk about what a dam removal project looks like. So this is a project I got to work on on Amethyst Brook in Pelham. This is a 20-foot tall dam. As you all are aware, this dam obviously blocks fish passage, but also those critical processes that keep a river healthy, namely the natural movement of water, sediment, and wood, which is indeed how a river builds habitat on its own. That's looking upstream. Here's looking downstream. So let's think about this. For 150 years, that structure, that 20-foot high structure, has trapped all this sediment and wood, all that habitat building material trapped. So this is a single point of 3,000 to 5,000 we have at the state, around the state, causing severe impairment. And I want to note a lot of this talk about sediment management is about how to navigate regulatory systems, how to move preferred alternatives through regulatory systems. I just want to level set and say this is allowed to happen through our existing regulatory structure. So go forward with confidence with what you're doing. You're removing dams and you're undoing over a century of impacts. So this is what removing a structure like this looks like. You'll divert the water, you'll get in there with large equipment, take it apart in a safe, controlled manner, and you'll have a final product. It looks like this when you're done. By the way, I'm going to drop a lot of notes in here. I'm not going to go over all these notes, but I know that this presentation is downloadable, and so will the deck be. So feel free to look at more detail later. But this is what this project looked like when it was completed. And then lots of partners. This was, I want to say, a 3 or 5 year endeavor. I should remember that. I was a project manager, but so many partners, so many grants. This is how our dam removals go these days, right? We have a lot of challenges to remove these structures. And then just 2 years later, it looks like this. Looks like nothing ever happened, you know? And I think you all see this time and time again. You get these benefits, and the findings of these benefits are documented locally, nationally, internationally. So removing dams restores rivers. Now, this is at the dam. Let's look downstream of the dam. And I want to thank dear friend Robin McEwen, who was one of the consultants on this project, for taking this amazing photo sequence that I want to share with you. So we're thinking about sediment. This is that same dam removal looking upstream just as the dam removal got going. So there's a big yellow machine up there. But this is the existing conditions in the stream. All right. So it's rocky. This looks nice. This is bad habitat for fish. Nothing spawning in here. Just before the dam removal. This is it during dam removal. We had a storm event that mobilized several thousand cubic yards of sediment. Most people see this and are horrified. They say, oh my gosh, how could you have such impacts? This is what regulators try to avoid, right? But what we were able to observe here is a month later transitioning to this. Just a month later, we see new floodplain benches. We see the river sorting that material, washing the fines down, leaving gravel behind. We're starting to aggrade this incised channel. This is within a month, the river's converting those impacts, short-term impacts to benefits. And then 6 months later, when the dam removal is done, we have this situation. Dramatic improvements to stream habitat. None of that visual impact remaining. And this is really a theme of this talk today, is that you're going to have these short-term impacts doing dam removals, but you're going to yield permanent, well-understood benefits that address that, what could be a century of degradation. Moreover, what happened here is allowable and permittable under existing regulations. That day Robin took this picture, she looked down in the stream and saw this. And these are sea lamprey. This stream had no sea lamprey in it for decades before the dam removal. And we know this because there's a sea lamprey scholar who lives in this watershed, right? So immediately after this dam removal, sea lamprey returned for the first time in decades. And this is how sediment release during dam removal can do more restoration. It can drive downstream habitat restoration as well. Those findings were published in a paper. You can download and read it at your leisure. And so this is one of my big takeaways for you today, is releasing what I'm going to call non-risky sediment, and we'll talk about that during dam removals, can significantly restore those downstream habitats as well within months. And I want to pose this question to you. How else could you get this benefits? Let's say we wanted to concoct a project that was stream bottom restoration with the purpose of returning sea lamprey to a beautiful stream like this. How would you do that? And how much would it cost? But here, as a side benefit of dam removal, we got that to happen. So this brings us to point 2. Keep sediment in rivers to restore even more. This approach is commonly called in-stream sediment management, downstream release. It's got a variety of terms, but it looks like this. And this is what most of our dams in Massachusetts look like, these small structures, right? So we get in there, If you can dewater the impoundment beforehand to make this help stabilize the sediments a bit, but get in there. Generally, this takes a couple days to a couple weeks. And then in this situation, the river was allowed to reform itself. This is completely passive sediment management. And within 3 months, all of that sediment was stabilized by just the native seed that was in the impoundment. So for no cost and downstream benefit and no risk and vibrant restoration, this approach was successful. But it's not always that simple. It's not always a situation where there are no risks, there's little sediment. Sometimes you have to be more creative. And so I want to share a little bit about a project in Northampton on the Upper Roberts Meadow Brook. This is a huge dam. This was 40 feet tall, impounded, tens of thousands of cubic yards of sediment. And this is a small trout stream. So the initial idea of what to do here was to mechanically dredge the material, truck it to a disposal location that would be created in the woods, and construct the channel through the impoundment. When the team expanded and we thought a little bit harder about what could happen here in light of potential downstream habitat restoration benefits, a different idea was developed involving stage removal. And I have to give a lot of credit to the engineer here, Matt Taylor, for this. But the idea here was, yeah, it would be great to release all of this sediment to benefit this trout stream, but there's a lot of it, and this stream is really small. And P.S., there's a downstream flooding risk. There's a road that already floods during storm events. So what was developed was an approach of removing a little bit at a time. Take the first bit off and do intensive downstream monitoring to trigger the next bit of release. So remove a bunch, remove a bit, look downstream. Is everything fine? Okay, remove the next lift. Is everything fine? Remove the next until you got to the end of the dam. So in that way, we're able to monitor for risks, do the dam removal a little more slowly, but save almost $1 million of sediment management cost and keep all that material in the stream. And here's what it looked like. Oh, and this is why I'm going to argue strongly to all of you, make this your default approach. Make in-stream management your default approach and let your evaluation process try to prove it otherwise. This is what it looked like upstream of that 40-foot dam. Moving from picture 1, 2, and 3, 4, you can see that this is just gradual channel evolution. This is no channel construction. This is just go ahead, river, take the sediment and form yourself. And some folks will look at those stream banks and say, that doesn't look good. That you should get in there and stabilize that, or it just doesn't look right. Well, from my perspective, this looks great. You just have to have a perspective of giving nature time to heal. There's no need to do anything else here. Let nature find its equilibrium, let it continue to drop that material into the stream for more restoration, as we're talking about. And if you do need to stabilize this, generally it's going to be to protect infrastructure. And that's an important part of your sediment evaluation that we're going to keep talking about. Okay, so use in-stream sediment management whenever you can. Third takeaway from today, use costly dredging disposal only for significant risks. What are significant risks? Well, in some places it's obvious. You're gonna come across sediment, particularly in urban areas where it looks like this, where number one, it's just an incredible solid waste problem. Like you could never consider consider letting this material go downstream. You cause a solid waste problem and public safety hazard from metal. You also are going to encounter sheens, strong petroleum odors, and then for a place like this, you're going to confirm through sampling and laboratory analysis this is full of significant levels of pollution. Important, though, is going to be to also test the sediment upstream and downstream. You have to estimate local background conditions. You can't consider risks from pollution in a vacuum. But certainly on the face of it, this looks like a place where, yeah, you might need to do that costly dredging disposal. And this is what that looks like. Here are two examples, one from a project in Taunton, another from a project in Pittsfield. Extremely expensive. This is full channel construction, bank stabilization, floodplain grading and planting, offsite trucking and disposal of every scoop of dirt you take out of here. In this case, in the Taunton case, they were able to reuse some of that on site. In the Pittsfield case, that was trucked out of state. So you're looking at $100 to $200 a cubic yard, and you're going to add millions and millions of dollars to projects and have substantial impacts and not get those benefits downstream. So this is reserved for significant risks. Pollution is much higher than background condition. Solid waste creates a hazard. The floodplain is too risky for people to come in contact with, or you're going to destabilize infrastructure. So those are your choices. How do you decide? You're going to evaluate local conditions. You have to think locally about sediment management. And it's challenging because right now we have no formal guidance. So the regulations don't tell you exactly how to do this. They offer some clues for things you should do. You can't draw upon another state guidance document or federal guidance document that's a perfect fit. There are good ones. The New Hampshire guidance document's pretty good, and the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation guide is pretty good, but they're just not perfect for our setting. We're densely developed, and our background pollutant levels are high. So you really need to consider background conditions. So we don't have formal guidance. So what I'm going to share with you is this story. We've kind of made it work as practitioners here over the last 15 years. So, and we've developed some tools to help you answer that question of what to do. And I'm going to share some of that. At a high level, this is not a training. We would need 8 hours to go through in detail everything you need to do. So I'm going to go through it in very high order. At the back of this deck, I'm including a 4-step recipe for doing this with more detail, but we're not going to get into that today. So when you download this PowerPoint deck later, there's more information at the end. So you need to play nature detective. This is your job as a dam removal project manager and team. You need to understand the site, the setting, the watershed. So you start by looking at the stream, the valley, the watershed, the land uses, upstream land uses, surrounding land uses. I'll speak to the potential for pollution, which is called a due diligence analysis, which you use to inform how you sample, what you sample for. You then do that work of taking sediment samples, assessing the characteristics of the sediment, because that makes a big deal too for mobility. And you do laboratory analysis of pollutants of interest. And critically, you collect background sediment information, upstream, downstream, and you compare pollutant findings from the impoundment to that local context, to that local background condition. And you also are collecting information on infrastructure, because this is not just about risks from pollution. It's also about the risks from potentially destabilizing infrastructure around a dam. And like I said, back of this deck has a lot more guidance on how to do all this. So let's look at an example dam to talk about what you're going to look for. So this is the dam up on the North Shore in Raleigh. Looking down on it on the left, the critical things I see here are, first of all, easy access to the dam. There's a road. You can get there without causing more damage. There's nothing around the dam. So there are no residences, there are no daycare facilities, there's no parks. There's no land uses that would cause concern about potential exposure of pollutants in that sediment. You and your engineers will get into this impoundment. You will measure the total volume of sediment that's there. You will take samples. You will probe for refusal. You'll take physical characteristic samples. You'll examine the dam to see what is there about the dam that can help you here? Is there a low-level outlet that you can use to drain the impoundment early? If not, can you notch it to dewater it early? All these kind of things. And beyond understanding the total volume of sediment behind this dam, you need to estimate something called the mobile volume of sediment. How much sediment is going to erode and evacuate and move downstream as the channel underneath this impoundment reforms. So let's fast forward after the dam removal to show you what that looks like. So here is the full impoundment. Fast forward to after the dam removal. This is what the mobile volume of sediment looks like. It's this thin ribbon where the river evacuated the sediment and the channel, the river was reborn again. So the mobile sediment is the volume of material to consider for ecological risks downstream. You're going to mobilize, if you mobilize pollutants in this area to downstream areas that are higher than background levels and above risk thresholds, you could impact downstream biota. You also need to consider exposure in the floodplain. So the mobile sediment scooted and went downstream. The rest of that impounded sediment firmed up in place as the new floodplain. Well, if you had residences and daycare facilities and places where children could eat soil, frankly, or where you could come into contact with the soil, you have higher risks. But if you don't have those things around, it's a different risk scenario. So there's outstanding guidance in Massachusetts for human health risk exposure from something called the Massachusetts Contingency Plan. So not at this site, but then the other dimension you need to look at is the infrastructure risks that I talked about. So downstream pollutant risks to ecology, new impoundment, new floodplain risks for human contact. But at a site like this, when you remove this dam where sediment's impounded behind, what about this railroad bridge right behind? Might that movement of sediment destabilize this railroad bridge? What about the sewer line that's running up river left here or that crosses the river upstream? You know, we don't talk often about infrastructure risks with sediment, but this is just as important as the pollutant risks. And sometimes this drives your management approach. You just can't let the river move sediment naturally because you need to do it in a more controlled way because you're going to destabilize sediment infrastructure. And this is done by a project engineer. This is obviously a very high risk setting. Okay. Now you've collected that information. You need to think about how risky are things. So before I give you the punchline on that, I just want to zoom out and ask you all to always ask this question. We're talking about managing typically a small volume of sediment behind a dam and making decisions about letting it go downstream or dredging it. So relative to what, right? This cannot be considered in a vacuum. Remember that the dam in place is a known risk for the river. So you're removing this thing that's been in place and is impacting the river in a known way. So you have to consider that your potential sediment management is a short-term, likely small risk relative to what's already happening with the dam in place. Secondly, I want you to think about the fact that sediment is always moving into a river. It just rained in my neighborhood here in Medford, Massachusetts. I walked around my neighborhood and I see sediment all over the street, running into storm drains, going down the block and into the Mystic River. The sediment is always entering our rivers that's polluted from yard runoff, from road runoff. And here's an example. You know, this is a pile of road sand and salt that's under a bridge up in Vermont. Every storm event, we're loading sediment into a river. So it's dynamic. So what you're doing is not the only input of sediment in a river. So let's get real. So here's the punchline. You've collected this information and you need to decide three things to make your decision about whether you can manage your sediment in stream or you need to do that costly dredging. One, are you going to degrade the downstream ecosystem? Are you going to release pollution that is significantly toxic, that includes persistent bioaccumulative toxins or significant elevations of petroleum hydrocarbons that is Um, a challenging question to answer, and there's some guidance at the end of this. Typically, my recommendation is you're going to compare your findings in the impoundment to published thresholds as well as background conditions. So question one, are you going to significantly degrade the downstream ecosystem? Secondly, are you going to create new health hazards in the floodplain? And that has to do with exposure scenarios. If there are sensitive receptors right around with high frequency and intensity of uses. That's also not something you can look at in a vacuum. And then thirdly, are you going to put local infrastructure at risk if you release sediment? So those are your three questions. If no to all those things, passive sediment management is your default approach. And remember those benefits we talked about. If maybe, you can try to mitigate and develop hybrid approaches. You can do things like push some of the sediment off to the side for timed release, excavate some of the sediment if you can identify a hot spot to reduce the overall mass of pollution, remove the dam in stages with monitoring to determine downstream impacts if it's sensitive. There are so many creative combinations of things you can do to allow you to keep at least partial in-stream sediment management as an option. And then your last option, if you have significant risks, is activate that very costly and I'd say damaging dredging and disposal option. So these are hard questions. You will need these things to help you make these decisions. You will need experts to call on. You will need knowledgeable consultants and contractors, and I see many of them on this call today. You will need tools. So the state has a sediment quality evaluation spreadsheet that will help you put together your findings, including from the impoundment and the upstream and downstream areas into comparisons with recommended thresholds for ecological impacts as well as human health contact impacts. And then you're going to need much more in-depth training. As I said at the start, I think this is to go through this in great detail is about an 8-hour training. So my hope is you walk away with high level knowledge today, but no more training is going to be required. So you will need these things. Then there are things that we all need to do these projects better. And as I come to my conclusion here, I just want to itemize some of these systems change issues that we all need to do this work more. The first is, in my view, setting higher expectations. We are getting comfortable with removing 3 or 5 or 6 dam removals a year. I would like to assert to you all practitioners that we can do better and we can do 1 a week. I'd like to see us do 50 a year. Then in 25 years, we can make a real impact for our rivers. We could remove half of our dams. We could remove 1,500 dams in 25 years. So I think we can raise our expectations. The second thing we need to do is work with the state to complete this guidance document. This is sitting in draft form. It is a state-of-the-art document that would provide an extremely thorough, vetted roadmap for all the details of this process I just described. So I'd like to call on partners and DEP to work together to find a way to finalize this. The third thing we need at system level is revamped regulations. We're currently in a wave in Massachusetts of tinkering with our existing regulations to try to make restoration easier. I don't see that being productive. We need to move much faster. And so we're starting in my organization to talk about a 3-in-3 proposal, which is 3 steps in 3 months. Single application, coordinated review, joint issuance, or presumptive approval. And that's, I think, the kind of change we need to really accelerate restoration in Massachusetts. We can't spend a year or a year and a half for projects that have such minimal impacts and such great benefits. And the last 2, we have to find some way to fund sediment cleanup in floodplains in urban areas. We have too many projects where the final cost of removing sediment in the floodplain is too much, and we stabilize it in place. And we're losing the opportunity to invite the public into those places, particularly urban areas, often environmental justice communities where green space is at a premium. And I'm not sure it's fair to ask dam removal uh, teams doing habitat restoration or dam owners who are not entirely responsible for a century of pollution coming their way to pay for that. So I would call for a public fund to help with a public problem. And then with all of you who've tuned in today and are watching this webinar series, I would say let's dedicate to learn and share together our lessons, what's working, what's not. So if there's any way, any forum for ongoing sharing could emerge from this, I think that would be a great outcome. So again, takeaways from today. My colleague Carly and my friend Dan kind of say it away, kind of say it all here. The dams need to go away and streams need sediment. So keep the sediment in the rivers if you can. Use that costly dredging option only for those very significant risks. It's very expensive and damaging. And then make sure you're evaluating your local conditions to decide. Do not consider risks in a vacuum. So with that, I'm going to end. I will flip forward just a couple slides just to show you there are extras after my talk, which get into this four recommended steps of looking at projects. But we're not going to get into this because I need to leave time for questions. So I am going to stop there. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you, Alex. That was fantastic. And especially with the extra information that people can access afterwards. And I do encourage everybody to go to the Mass Rivers website and look at the Dam Busters site. You'll see under each entry for each session, there's a materials button that you can push on, and we will be uploading all of this as soon as we can. I see that we have 4 questions in the Q&A, so I'm going to throw those your way. So the first one is from Jonas. At Amethyst Brook, were any negative ecological impacts observed following the mass sediment mobilization after the storm event?
No, no. And it was just incredible. I mean, not only did we see the kind of geomorphic changes that rapidly with the thinning out of that material, the sorting, the deposition of gravel, the aggradation. Downstream, we also saw the development of wood jams. So sediment bars formed downstream. Sediment bars caught wood. Wood catches other wood. And we had bars, and that's how streams start to make habitat. So we saw all that happen so quickly. I mean, Jonas, for the few days, perhaps that intense smothering happened. I have to imagine there were some impacts. But insects burrow, fish can flee and come back. So without question, that smothering is an impact. But I think what I want you to leave with is this understanding that, a few weeks of impact may be worth the significant kind of incredible benefits that we witnessed at a place like that. Complete overhaul of benthic habitat, jumpstarting of the large wood regime, new dynamism in the stream, wood jams. Yeah. So yes, temporary smothering, quickly transitioning within under a month to permanent benefits.
Right. Thank you. Okay, next question is from Courtney. What is the risk of moving and capping contaminated sediments within the floodplain rather than removing it completely? What is the likelihood it will move downstream?
That's a great question. I mean, floodplains are dynamic places with climate change and increased storm intensity. One could argue that trying to stabilize things in the floodplain is folly. I think it depends on how much rock you want to use, which, further counters a restoration aim, which is to encourage dynamism in a river. You want a river to be able to move around and find its form. So, I mean, if you put enough money and hardening on a floodplain, I think you can try to keep polluted sediment in place. This is where I think we just have to find the money. I don't know why we're leaving pollution in a floodplain, especially where we're finding it, which is mostly in urban areas. Let's get that out of there. We have to find a public funding instrument for that. I don't personally think leaving polluted sediment in a floodplain is a great call, but that's the reality when we can't scrape together that money after scratching for years to put money together to do a project. So I appreciate the reality of having to do that, but I don't think it's personally sensible.
Great. Okay. Thank you. By the way, Jonas says he's very happy with your answer, and other people are really appreciating the answers you're providing. Okay. So next one is from Dan. The examples shown seem mostly to show the two extremes of sediment management, i.e., let it rip or haul it out. In your experience, are hotspot sediment removals a viable path to investigate during the permitting process, considering how scrutinized the evaluation and execution will be by regulatory agencies?
Great question, Dan. I mean, I think it has to do with the intensity of your sampling program. If when you're sampling the mass of sediment behind the dam, you know, unless you're peppering that area with many samples, it's kind of needle in a haystack. And we've seen this over a decade of work. You can literally take a sample and then a couple feet and find high lead, and take a sample a couple feet over and find low lead. Like there's just really this it's not homogeneous. It's very heterogeneous. So, I always recommend using average pollutant concentrations in the impoundment as the thing that's driving risk, not hotspots. That said, I think there are times when you've done an intense enough sampling program and through multiple points can say, look, that is an area that appears to be higher concentration. And maybe you triangulate that with some other evidence, like it's below a storm drain that's draining the parking lot of a gas station, right? Like it's not just about the data. So you're using your head. You're saying, look, I'm finding elevated pHs below an outfall draining a paved area, including industrial sites. And I have findings, I have sample points that let me say that area right there might be more polluted. Then absolutely, hotspot removal is a very viable approach that regulators will accept, and it is a good middle ground position in places. But I just want to really express you just have to have enough sampling because it's so needle in a haystack what you can find behind an impoundment. And if I didn't answer that question fully, ask it again.
I think some of the upcoming questions might be a little bit
Go ahead.
related. Okay. Wenley asks, in an area with contaminated sediment, if the sediment is capped, is a marker layer needed?
Wenley, such a good question. I mean, that's never come across in my experience working with regulators. And I'm not, I wonder, Wenley, are you interested in the kind of formation of new soils on top of that over time? I assume, or are you concerned more about it eroding down and getting into I'm going to guess it's the latter. I'm going to guess it's that you might want to monitor and see over time if there's erosion getting down into the capped area. That's not something I've heard of happening in Massachusetts. I think that's a really sensible idea, Wenley, if the risks are super high. But again, I think this speaks to like why are we leaving polluted sediment in floodplains? If we have to go to these, of course it's going to erode over time. That's what rivers do. So it's only a matter of time, I would say, unless you really lock it in place with a lot of stuff you don't want to do in a floodplain.
Great. We're getting a lot of great information adding to what you're saying in the chat too.
I should look
So
at the chat too. Let me open that
I
up.
encourage people to take a glance at the chat. Corey is asking, have you done work in watersheds under a phosphorus TMDL? In the Lake Champlain Basin, there's great concern that released sediment that carries phosphorus will further exacerbate the lake's phosphorus problem.
That's a great question. It is an issue we've chewed on here in Massachusetts. Um, I, we've done extra sampling on some sites related to nutrients and concerns about downstream eutrophication. Um, I think you're right. It's very context dependent. Remember, your evaluation has to be localized. So where you are in the Champlain Valley, knowing your issue with phosphorus, and you don't, of course, understand what the river is carrying for phosphorus load. That's part of your background assessment. And then when you look at what's behind a dam, I would test for phosphorus. That's very wise. But how much mass is there? Like it's not just the concentration. I think folks here recognize that it's the mass. So It's the concentration times the amount of material. So you may have high phosphorus concentrations, but unless you have a huge volume behind the dam, I guess I would ask, relative to what again? Relative to how much is that river carrying downstream every year, every storm event? I think that's the kind of analysis. I know that setting that you probably want to get into in that set, or at least that's what I would recommend, without knowing more. So, relative to what? Because remember, there are those benefits of letting that sediment go for cost, for doing your next dam removal, or the habitat benefits. So, if it's a risk relative to what the river's already doing, then you might think about maybe you can stabilize some of it in place, through early drawdown, through stage dam removal. You can get creative there, but let the local context dictate the risk, I would say.
Okay, we've got one more question in the Q&A, but I'm actually going to ask one from the chat. Can you talk more about dewatering early and the
Mhm.
benefits of that, since you were just touching on
Yeah, absolutely. So as you're getting to know the site, you're playing nature detective when you're running a dam road project. You're gonna investigate the dam itself, and your engineer is going to do this. And does it have a low level out? Do you have a way to get the water off of the impoundment? Whether it's through a gate or there are dams have all sorts of configurations. But if you can lower the water behind a dam prior to dam removal, then you stand a great chance of starting to dry out the sediments that are behind the dam. You may even, if you're able to dry the sediment enough, start to see vegetation growth to further stabilize the new floodplain sediments. You may even start to see the old channel take form again. Um, so there are all kinds of benefits as far as um, how do I want to say that stabilization effect in the floodplain, and kind of starting to just firm stuff up. Now, in many places, that is going to require some regulatory coordination. Um, you certainly would want to contact in Massachusetts your local conservation agent. I see some of my colleagues from DER on the call here. Chris Hirsch is here, but I don't recall if you need to contact our 401, our state DEP office to do that. I don't think you do, but anyway, it may need regulatory coordination to do that. You don't just want to pop the gate, and it's something done in a controlled way by an engineer. But yes, there are many benefits just for stabilizing sediment early.
right.
Oh,
Right.
especially if you're going to do that costly dredging and disposal. I mean, that's where it really is important. Because remember, if you take a scoop of sediment out and it's full of water, and you're putting that in a truck and you're going to go pay for it by the ton at a state landfill, like you need the sediment to be as dry as possible. So if you're gonna do a costly dredging and disposal project, dewatering early is an absolute must, as far as I'm concerned. You have to take that weight out of the material.
Great, thank you. So here's the last questions in the Q&A, and if anybody has other Q&A questions, put them in that function. Great presentation. Sarah says, great presentation and note on permit streamlining. How realistic is this in the nearest term, especially when local, state, and federal permits are required?
Well, other states have done it. California has a cutting the green tape initiative that some of you may have heard of, where they worked for a number of years and coordinated all permitting, state, federal, to to do what we're talking about here. So it's doable. That we know it's doable. I have to ask, why can't we do it here? We're Massachusetts. We have things like the biodiversity initiative. We have all these great state programs that for things we hope to achieve for climate change and resilience. And we know that the existing regulatory structure is a strong headwind preventing our forward progress. So I think there's a significant amount of very well intentioned work happening right now to try to work within the existing structures and improve them, and that's wonderful. I just personally I don't think that's going to be enough. I just think we need to dream differently. Like, we can do this. We can dream differently. There can be a Ecological Restoration Act of 2025 that requires new regulations and coordination among agencies and a single application and coordinator review and joint issuance in 3 months. We can do this. We just have to dream differently To be okay with the status quo right now is not okay. It just takes too long. And these are not that damaging projects. The risks are too low. And how long, I'd ask further, say, how long do we have to spend public money on this before we start to retreat from the ocean with sea level rise? Like we're in a window of opportunity right now to make a difference in our rivers and streams. So this is the major headwind. Let's turn it into a tailwind.
You're getting a lot of agreement in the chat, and then people are pointing out how burdensome permitting is for EJ communities. So there's a lot, obviously, to what you're saying, and it seems like a lot of agreement out there. Sean is asking, going back to Wenley's question, if it's going to cost quite a bit of money to excavate and haul off contaminated sediment in bank areas, and it's more economically viable to cover contaminated sediment with 12 inches of clean soil designed with non-erosive material, would it be feasible to exclude the geotextile fabric that is typically required in Rhode Island below the 12 inches of clean fill for capping contaminated soils, especially since the newly exposed bank areas will likely naturally revegetate quickly and revert back to natural condition? It seems Rhode Island capping requirements are developed more for sites that will be more accessible or have higher chances for direct exposure.
Oh, Sean, that is way too complicated question. I can't even, I'm not even going to touch that one. I don't know. Like that's just too, like, we need to know a lot more about your context and that project. And I, that kind of hurts my head to think about all the details without, I do need to know more. Sorry.
Yeah,
Pass.
yeah. Sorry, Sean.
Sorry,
That
Sean.
one is definitely sort of more
You can,
technical and Rhode Island, maybe Rhode Island specific, and that's exactly the kind of thing that we hope to get into in the next iteration of the series.
but Sean, I'm happy if you want to email me and like share some more information. I'd be happy to be a thinking partner on that. I just would need to know more.
Okay, Michael asks, excellent presentation, Alex. Is there concern about creating and establishing incised streams through the impounded sediments? Have projects installed large wood or other grade controls to ensure stream flows reshape sediments laterally as well?
That's a great question. I would say, first of all, initial incision with the in-stream sediment management, natural channel formation is to be expected, and it's just a matter of time. As I showed in that one photo sequence, that it also, of course, depends on the timing of storm events and the intensity of storms that are going to make those channel forming flows come through, right? So let's just say a normal hydrologic year where you have channel shaping flows maybe once. I mean, it just is a matter of time. I just don't think we need to be concerned about initial incision. Just appreciate that the channel will find its form. The floodplain will shape itself. You will have benches. You will probably have wood expose itself in the floodplain, and you certainly will have wood coming downstream again. In terms of adding wood to, um, to that setting, I guess in my experience, it's kind of it's pretty hard to get out in that soft sediment when it's reforming with heavy equipment, hauling wood to place it. And when you are placing it, I almost feel like you're making a guess. You certainly would encourage deflection and kind of re-meandering sooner. A new floodplain that's soft sediment that's full of wood is going to develop with high complexity quickly, in my view. So, but can you get the wood out there, or will it just come downstream? I mean, these are all interesting questions. I think my punchline is just give it time. Like, just give it time. Unless there's a risk with infrastructure and need to stabilize it, just give it time and celebrate the miracle of nature as it reforms itself.
Great, thank you. Okay, Julia's asking, in your experience, I love this question, do you think it's better to revegetate with plantings or let the seed bank respond?
Great question. Again, this is where you need to evaluate your local conditions. Again, I know I'm a broken record on this, but this is really what this is all about. So if you have an upstream watershed or full of invasive species, and maybe you have invasive species already at the fringes of this impoundment, if you are completely hands off, chances are you're going to get an impoundment full of invasive species. Like, but if you have few or no invasives upstream, then a completely hands-off approach might be fine. Um, there are also characteristics of the valley that will dictate the risk of invasive recruitment. Like a wide open valley, you have a much more opportunity for wind drift of invasive seeds. A narrow valley with canopy cover that's more sheltered, less risk of that. So there's just a lot of factors that go into your invasive risk. I mean, in general, I think it's safe to say, at least the projects I've worked on with in Massachusetts, which is about 27, in general, we haven't had many invasive species problems. And when we have, they've been enormous. When we have and we made at one of our cranberry farm sites, we um, there was an invasive willow that I didn't pay adequate attention to. Dam came out, willow went bonkers. This invasive willow just took over the impoundment. It was in tons of effort to try to get that under control. So, as far as seeding goes or planting goes, I think if you're trying to reestablish shade more quickly, if you have a cold water stream to jumpstart it with some trees can make sense. For diversity, it can make sense. Um, it depends on what's around. Also, for mother trees, we're going to drop seedlings in for the natural reforestation that happens in a floodplain. So, seeding again, I think can be a best practice if you have a high risk of invasive plants there. But yeah, sorry to give a clear answer. Again, I think it's context specific. What's happening there and upstream?
I love that. It is so dependent on location and conditions. So I thought that was a great question. Okay, I think that brings us to the end of all of our questions and to the end of this wonderful presentation by Alex. Alex, you got rave reviews as
Oh,
your presentation was going on. So those of us on the Dam Busters team just couldn't be more delighted. This is exactly the kind of information and value we wanted to bring to our audience.
oh, thank you. Appreciate that.
For everyone in the audience, a few things. Please remember that the next webinar is on September 11th. And also, please remember to fill out your evaluations when they come in and to be on the lookout for our signups for the in-person dam removal site visit. Thanks to everybody and see you in September. Bye.
Thank you.